Hi, everyone, and welcome again to the musical Innertube. I, as always, am Don Rooney.
And I am John Timpane, and we are proud to have on our podcast today Ron Brownstein. He's been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize a couple of times for his coverage of presidential campaigns. And these days, I hope this is still true, Ron, you're still a senior editor at The Atlantic, am I correct?
Senior at The Atlantic and senior political analyst at CNN.
One of the many reasons we wanted to have Ron on, first of all, he has a new book out, Rock Me on the Water, subtitled 1974, the year Los Angeles transformed movies, music, television, and politics. It's really a wonderful survey of the middle of a decade, and we'll talk about this, that Don and I know personally very well and we're involved in. I also want to run on because back in the day when I was the op-ed editor for the Philadelphia Inquirer, I used to publish Ron quite a bit. I always knew that his op-ed pieces were among the clearest and most cogently reasoned that I could find, and he was national political correspondent, I believe, and national affairs columnist for the LA Times.
I was, and I appreciated the platform.
Yeah, yes, it was, and I always got great mail whenever Ron's pieces. Probably because people understood them, Ron. So I want to congratulate you.
Let me just start off by asking Ron, what the hell happened to us?
Yeah, there we go. It's funny. From my perspective, John, you mentioned that you run my stuff over the years. I've covered politics since the early 1980s. It's like hard to imagine that, we've all been doing this long. This was my 10th presidential campaign, but I've always covered it more from the outside in than the inside out. And by that, I mean, I have never been the guy to go to kind of reconstruct what happens inside campaigns and, who said what to who and who was up and who was down. I've always been much more interested in how the strategies and agendas of the two parties kind of intersect with the changes in America itself, economically, demographically, which is a lot of what I've been writing about the last 20 years, and culturally. And that's kind of what led me to my interest in this book, which was like, how was culture and politics intersecting and bouncing off each other in the early 1970s, which was much like our own period in the sense of being a moment of intense generational transition.
Yes.
And substantial political backlash to that generational transition and the cultural changes that kind of came in its wake. And that's sort of how, at one level, how I got into this story about LA in the early 1970s.
It happens on so many levels, as you show in your book, Ron. For every Jack Nicholson, there's a Steven Spielberg, right? For every sort of edgy character, there's somebody who pulls back a little and is more centrist. And for every Richard Nixon, there's a Jerry Brown figure. And I'm very interested because I remember Prop 13 and how that changed just about everything, and that was the backlash personified in a lot of ways. Yeah. In fact, you're probably familiar with the book The Revenge of the Haves.
Yes, you can see it over my shoulder if we were doing this in Zoom. It's on the bookshelf by Robert Kuttner.
And I think it's one of the most perfectly named books because that's really what we had. We had a tremulous moment, which you talk about, where a generation with new points of view is making music, is making movies and television, or at least influencing television. And the politics seems to be changing. And then in just a couple of years, it's very different.
Yeah. So exactly. And even as the change is happening, there is pushback. I mean, there's at any given moment, there's always ebb and flow in American life. I mean, the current never, I think. I mean, I don't know if that's too strong a statement, but I actually don't think it is. The current never entirely runs solely in one direction. It's always kind of a push and pull. And the question is kind of, where does it come out? Where does the net out in the end? I mean, the story that I tell is how television, movies, and music, and to some extent politics, were all transformed by the rise of the baby boom and how the cultural critiques of American life that emerged in the social movements in the 1960s, ideas that were really kind of like on the vanguard at that point, were kind of almost, considered insurrectionary, changing relations between men and women in the early stage of the feminist movement, more suspicion of business and government, the early environmental movement, more demands for inclusion for previously marginalized groups. All of these ideas emerged out of the social movements in the 60s, but the bridge that brought them to the mass American audience was mass pop culture. And my story is about how within a few years, all three of those giant cultural industries, music, movies, and television, incorporated these ideas. These ideas became part of kind of the language of television in the era of All in the Family and MASH and Mary Tyler Moore, and obviously of Hollywood in the really renaissance that went on from the late 60s through the early 70s in movies like both Godfathers and Carnal Knowledge and Chinatown and Shampoo and Nashville, and obviously in music as well. But I point out in the book that even as these ideas were triumphing in popular culture, Richard Nixon was winning 2 elections by mobilizing the portions of America who were the most unhappy about the way the culture was changing. I mean, his silent majority, kind of, the antecedent of the Trump coalition. And it's just a reminder that, first of all, change happens first in culture and second in politics in many ways, because culture, I think, has to be more receptive to the viewpoints of emerging generations than politics does. The electorate has always been and probably always will be older and whiter than the country overall, which is one reason why it is possible, like Trump, like Nixon, like Reagan, to mobilize a really big coalition, even a winning coalition, against the way the country is changing. What I argue in the book, though, is that while you can win elections by, opposing the way the country is changing, what you can't actually do is stop the way the country is changing. And the culture that emerged in the early 1970s didn't mean that the left was always going to win elections, but it was a better predictor of how we were going to be living our day-to-day lives in the 80s and 90s. I mean, we did not go back to the Donna Reed show after Nixon and Reagan won elections. And I think the same is true now, by the way.
You couldn't do it after the Mary Tyler Moore show. You couldn't go back to that. It basically reset everything to such an extent that you had to rethink what a quote unquote woman's program was. And it was more likely to be something like Maude or Designing Women than it was to be like the Donna Reed show.
Yeah, it's funny, John, as you know, sometimes when younger generations look at these shows or movies, I think it's different with the music, but with the television and the movies, they are struck, understandably, by how much of kind of the pre-60s thinking still survive, how much of Laura Petrie there still is in Mary Richards in the early 1970s. And of course, the symbol of that was that she still called Lou Grant Mr. Grant, while the men on the show called him Lou. And James L. Brooks, who was the creator with Alan Burns, always defended that by saying, look, people may not like it, but that's what I believe this character would do. A small town, a woman from Minnesota kind of coming into the big city of Minneapolis, the Minneapple. But and I think the same can be true in movies. When you look at the relations between men and women, or the role of Black people in the movies, and all of that is true. That from our perspective today, a lot of this seems almost kind of antediluvian or kind of trapped in amber and old thinking. But from the hardest thing in history is to kind of understand things in the context of their own times and not your own times. And it is. It is pretty unequivocal that these shows, All in the Family, MASH, Mary Tyler Moore, the movies, they represented an enormous change from what came before. Because as I talk about at great length in the book, the dominant strategy in both Hollywood and especially the television networks during the 1960s was to do their best to ignore everything that was happening around them. I mean, the networks didn't get any closer to Vietnam than Gomer Pyle and McHale's Navy, right? And, we were getting Green Acres and Beverly Hillbillies and Petticoat Junction and the Andy Griffith Show. The theory of the networks was you needed, at that point, only 3 networks. Every show had to have enormous audiences, and therefore it could not be, if they used to talk about the least objectionable program. That was the operating theory. And as a result, they kind of narcotized, the audiences through the entire 60s. And it was really only at the very end of the decade, as I, in some ways, as I recount in considerable depth in the book, that CBS, ironically, as the network that had kind of given America most of those, what did Fred Silverman call them? Shit kicker shows.
Yeah.
They were the ones who decided that they had to get younger, they had to get more urban. And that led to the decision, the turning point in television history, to put All in the Family on the air in 1971. And the same thing was happening in the studios. After Easy Rider in 1969, it was clear there was a tremendous financial incentive to start producing stuff that seemed more relevant to the values and experiences of the younger generation. And so, after the 60s had been Sound of Music, Mary Poppins, My Fair Lady, even The Great Escape. I love The Great Escape. I'm sure we can all remember Steve McQueen on the motorcycle. But,
Sure.
All of these movies were looking back or looking away from what was happening. And suddenly they realized they had to connect the medium to the moment. And that is what I think led to the transformation in both television and movies.
One of the things that always got me was when they decided that they needed to get the kids. And it led to stuff like Richard Nixon on Laugh-In saying, "Sock it to me."
Yeah.
And, just one of those token things that they were doing to try to get the kids behind them. And it didn't seem to work.
Well, even Don, I thought Laugh-In itself is kind of like that, right? Because if you look at like the top 10 shows in 68, 69, Laugh-In is the only one that has any connection to contemporary culture. And even it was not really, a big source of social commentary in the way, say, the Smothers Brothers had been. Like Nixon was to Laugh-In as Laugh-In was to NBC. Like I'm doing an SAT test here. But Nixon doing Sock It To Me on Laugh-In kind of played the same function in his campaign that Laugh-In existing at all played in the overall kind of offering of NBC, which, and that was where they were. And it is striking that the pressure to change came out of the business staff above all. And it came out of the business staff at CBS above all, which was the most successful network. But they, the LA Times TV writer, wrote at some point in this process, what CBS concluded was that how many farmers you had watching didn't matter unless you were trying to sell tractors, right? and so, of all people, this guy named Bob Wood, and I tell the story in the book of Bob Wood and Norman Lear because obviously we all remember, and Norman Lear is revered as the visionary who changed television with All in the Family and really made it, I think All in the Family is the beginning of the road to peak TV because it irrevocably established the idea that television was a fit platform from which to comment on the society around you. You watch those episodes of All in the Family and they are living in the same world as the viewers. Nixon, Watergate is happening. Archie and Mike are yelling at each other about Watergate. Just think about how radical that was compared to even Lucy, much less the Beverly Hillbillies, which might have been happening, at any time in I don't know if anybody knew who the president was under Lucy. But so Norman is justifiably, heralded for that, although I kind of talk about what an unlikely revolutionary he was. But his partner in all of this was this guy named Bob Wood, who came up through KNXT radio and then KNX TV here in LA. He was a very conservative guy, a USC graduate, a Nixon fan, a Reagan fan. He hated the student demonstrators. He was a big football rah-rah guy, would not be caught dead reading the Port Huron statement. And yet he was the one who was ultimately convinced that they had to change what they were doing, even though they were number one. And he took the heat because Bill Paley did not like, who was the chairman of CBS, did not like All in the Family. And there were lots of other people who did not like All in the Family. But he made the call and stuck with it and put it on TV and kind of in its wake, MASH. Think about how revolutionary MASH was through this thinnest of veils, setting it in Korea, criticizing the Vietnam War, criticizing the army, criticizing bureaucracy while we were still fighting in the field. I mean, it's rather remarkable. And then even Mary Tyler Moore, which was gentler and whose changes were more evolutionary than revolutionary, again, changing the role of women on TV. I tell the story in the book, and listeners may know this, that when Mary Tyler Moore was first, when the show first started, CBS absolutely, adamantly refused the original idea from Burns and Brooks that she be divorced. They would not let her be divorced. At one meeting, somebody said to them, fellas, people are going to think she divorced Dick Van Dyke. Within a few years, after they had spun off Rhoda and they had married Rhoda off because they thought that would have good ratings, they realized that having Rhoda be married led them to a dead end. And you know what? They let Rhoda get divorced, and no one raised a peep. I mean, the world was just different. 5 years after Mary Tyler Moore went on the air, the world was different, but the TV world was different too.
I've heard from a number of guys who work in television writing that said that they got into television writing because Rob Petrie had Mary Tyler Moore as a wife, and they figured if they got in there, they would have Mary Tyler Moore as a wife too. But Mary Tyler Moore was also the wife that was sleeping in a separate bed from Rob Petrie. Yeah. And then when she got her own show, they wouldn't let her get divorced.
They would not let her be divorced.
It seemed like they were working really hard to de-sex her throughout her career.
Although I from the perspective of 50 years later, I've always wondered why it was better that she lived with a guy. And like for listeners who don't, who might not have studied the Talmud of Mary Tyler Moore, the setup of the show is that she lived with a guy, basically supported him through medical school. And then when he finished, he dumped her. And so she left her small town in Minnesota and moved to the big town of Minneapolis. And of course, famously throws her hat up in the opening sequence. And in the first season, the very famous theme song, the lyrics were, "You might just make it after all." And by the second season, they had moved that to, as you may recall, those of us slightly old enough to remember may recall, they moved the lyrics to "You're gonna make it after all of it."
Exactly.
And that was kind of the evolution that they went through with her on the show.
I want to think aloud a moment, since we're talking about a single woman and her impact, the impact of her portraiture. So a lot of these artists that we're talking about, they change things by not necessarily by saying things out loud, not necessarily by preaching, but by being what they were. And so the two people I have in mind right now are Linda Ronstadt and Joni Mitchell. I'm thinking of Joni because we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Blue, which is this incredible album. But I think both of them, they did it in different ways. But first of all, the thing that they have in common that I was impressed with at the time, and I think Don was too, we used to talk about this, Don, is they insisted on artistic control. Right, that they had to fight for it. Each one had to fight for it, but in the end, they made the product that they wanted to make, and that was really different. Wasn't that a big break?
Yes, but I think their experience was quite different. And Linda Ronstadt, I think, is more emblematic of what the environment was like in those years. I mean, Joni Mitchell, I interviewed over 120 people in writing this book, and no one was called a genius by other artists more than Joni Mitchell. I think she was viewed by her contemporaries as operating on some unbelievable sphere of, some combination of the songwriting and the performing and the beauty. And she just seemed like, she kind of fell out of Olympus and, landed in Laurel Canyon. Linda Ronstadt's experience was very different, because and I think as great as it was, the documentary about her kind of obscures this. She really had a tough time for several years. I mean, she kind of described them as kind of the years of grinding it out, and it was precisely Don because of what you're talking about, the inability initially to get artistic control. I mean, she was in the Stone Ponies, that band at the beginning, and they had that hit from the Michael Nesmith of the Monkees song. Different, you and I different drum. And then Stone Ponies broke up and she's on her own. And she had this vision, this sound in her head that she was trying to achieve, like many of her contemporaries in LA at the time, this kind of new blend of rock and country and blues and folk. And in that era, as I write about at length in the book, in all of these industries, whether we're talking about TV, movies, or music, the decision makers were men and only men. And she had a very hard time for years getting anybody to kind of listen to her and to, take her ideas seriously. There was an awful lot of, kind of patting her on the head and don't you worry your pretty little head about it. And, she was staggeringly, beautiful and sexy, but she was also insecure, kind of giggly at times in those years. And it was really hard for her to kind of make progress. The low point being when Capitol Records put her on the cover, like in a pigsty, I think, where she was kind of ready, the cover of one of the albums, like she was ready for a role in the day, like The Farmer's Daughter. And she talked to me at length and really, I thought was incredibly perceptive about the dynamics of the music scene in those years and the relationships between the people, but also very honest about the struggle she had to find really anyone, any guy who would take seriously what she was trying to achieve musically. And it wasn't until she connects with Peter Asher, who was the former Apple Music executive, still heard to this day on Sirius XM, telling stories about the Beatles. But at that point was the producer and manager of James Taylor. And, after she had run through a whole range of producers, most of whom were also her boyfriend at one point. She finally connects with Peter Asher and they produce her breakthrough album, Heart Like a Wheel, which is released in November 1974 and is one of four. I mean, talk about the, kind of miraculous year of 1974. 1974 gives you Heart Like a Wheel, her breakthrough album, Late for the Sky, which is Jackson Browne's kind of youthful masterpiece, On the Border, which is the turning point album for the Eagles when they get their harder rocking sound. And really, there's no question that they're going to make it to the top tier. And then as you kind of alluded to, Joni Mitchell had Court and Spark, her most successful commercial album. So, but Linda Ronstadt's story really was echoed by a lot of women in those years, not only in music, but also in television and in movies. It really is the beginning of inclusion, but it is, a very narrow beachhead, and every inch these women really had a fight for.
A couple of things that occurred to me while you were talking there, Ron, was number one, when I was at Loyola Marymount University, I was on the college radio station, and we sponsored concerts. And one of the concerts that we sponsored was Linda Ronstadt, and her backup band was a band that later became the Eagles.
Exactly.
And she came out in that concert, I remember, and just really took charge. She was really singing and really, really, really going to town. And some people who had seen her in earlier concerts said that they'd never seen her so dynamic and so upfront. She was a little shy at some of those other concerts. So that was one thing that occurred to me. The other thing was, one of the first jobs I had after I got out of college was a part-time job at a radio station called K-West, which had been a beautiful music station, and they changed to rock and roll. And their studios were on the roof of a building that was directly across the street on the Sunset Strip from the Whiskey A Go-Go. And I had to, whenever I went to work, I had to find parking on the side of a hill that was next to the building. And then you got into a little glass elevator and went all the way to the top to their studios.
Oh, wow.
And it was just, it was kind of freaky. A lot of the disc jockeys that worked there were guys that had worked in LA radio for a while. And I remember one of them telling me, over that hill behind us is where it's all happening. Over the hill behind us was like Laurel Canyon. It wasn't right there, but it was within a mile or a couple of miles. And he says, that's where they all are. That's where Linda Ronstadt is. That's where Crosby, Stills, and Nash are. That's where all of the music is going on. They're all putting it together right over our shoulder, it seemed. They were all putting all that music together, and that just kind of freaked me out.
I'm going to express envy because I grew up in New York. I wasn't here in those years. And as you're telling these stories, I am reminded that, I was writing this book during the Trump years, and then we were kind of finishing it during the pandemic. And like it felt at times like a vacation to go spend time in 1974 LA. Obviously, there's a lot of work that goes into a book, but just like I remember thinking like, wouldn't it be great to just kind of go through the hot tub time machine and kind of come out in the colony in 1974 at Linda Ronstadt on Saturday night, because like people would talk about Graham Nash said, yeah, when we went to somebody's house on Saturday night, we took our guitars, and everybody would sit around and play. And, there was On the Rocks, which was Lou Adler's club above the Roxy, right near the Whiskey, where kind of the movie stars and the music, figures would kind of hang out together. And, it did, in addition to all of the cultural import that I write about, I mean, I think what I really try to convey in this book is that this was a lot of fun. And Angelica Houston was one of, interestingly, the women, to make a gross simplification, the men, when you interview men about kind of their story, they're all like brave Ulysses. They're out kind of, conquering the high seas, and they tell you about their victories and triumphs. And by and large, the women are much more likely to kind of think about how all of these pieces fit together and not just tell you their story, but kind of the group dynamic. And that was true for Linda Ronstadt on the music side. It was true for Linda Bloodworth Thomason on the TV side, because she worked with all of those.
And Mary Kay Place.
And Mary Kay Place was great too. And then Angelica Houston in the movie side. But I was growing up in New York. These were years when New York was kind of spiraling into bankruptcy. And these were the years of Ford to New York Drop Dead. I mean, Woody Allen may have been dripping with condescension for LA, but LA really wasn't looking to New York for validation. I mean, they kind of, people recognize, I don't think people fully understood the magnitude of how this was happening horizontally across all of these industries. I mean, the music people were focused on music, TV on TV, movies on movies. And they were somewhat aware of what a dynamic period it was in the other spheres as well. Mostly they were focused on their own, but people recognized in their own lanes that something special was going on. I mean, if you talk to whether it's Irving Azoff or Rob Reiner or Brooks or Lear, they all understood that, or the people, people in the movies at that time, they all understood that this was kind of a special period. And man, I hope I convey it in the book. It really would have been a lot of fun to be there, and you guys were. So
yes.
I tip my hat.
I want to get in on the envy, because Linda Ronstadt came straight from Don's campus to mine. I mean, I think she did. I saw her at the same tour, and she had.
Well, Jackson Browne was on that tour. I don't know if by the fall they were together, but in the spring, it was Jackson Browne and Linda Ronstadt touring together. And they would alternate who was the headliner, based, I think, mostly on who sold more records in each market that they went to. And, they were not, I mean, this was at the point where Geffen, and of course, they were both Geffen artists, David Geffen artists at Asylum Records. And Geffen had manufactured the band Bob Dylan reunion, and they were flying around in a private plane in that concert tour that eventually became that great concert album.
Absolutely.
But for Jackson Browne and Linda Ronstadt, they had advanced the big kind of step into luxury for them was they had advanced from a station wagon that they would load themselves into a tour bus that was being loaded by others. And Jackson Browne had to send out his manager to buy some plywood to nail over some of the tops of the seats so they had someplace to lie down. This was after a few nights of sitting up in the seats and sleeping all night in the sitting up, which kind of left them a little cranky for the next day's show. But that was where they were in their career. It really wasn't until Heart Like a Wheel that she became, capital letters, Linda Ronstadt.
Sure. So I don't expect anybody to be able to disentangle this next question, but it's something I did think about while I was reading your book, Ron. You hear people talking about, the culture, and you did touch on it when we started talking. I'm wondering if you can comment at least on the extent to which politics and popular culture influence each other. It seems as though there is some interplay here. You say it's complex. Of course it is. And it's not like one side pushes the other side off the stage or anything. There's give and there's take. But do you see evidence that one side did throw its shadow over the other?
In the long run, yeah. I mean, look, there are two ways to answer that question. I mean, I wrote a book 30 years ago called The Power and the Glitter, which was a history of how Hollywood had actually participated in politics. So we can talk about, the way in which movie stars or rock stars or TV stars, actually engage in campaigning for people or lending their name to causes, or, Gregory Peck, I think, doing the ad against Robert Bork in 1987. But more profound, really, is the way that politics and pop culture both respond to and reflect the big changes in the country itself. And I think that what happened in the late 60s and early 70s is very similar to what is happening now. So, as I said at the beginning, I think the basic story that I tell is that as the baby boom was rising in the late 60s to become a growing share of the consumer market for all of these entertainment industries, they all felt the need to respond to that by producing program that was more relevant to the experiences and values of the baby boom. And because of that, you get this tremendous economic tailwind for an artistic renaissance first of all. But second of all, the kind of incorporation or the embedding of ideas that had seemed heretical in the 60s in the pop culture of the early 1970s. And I really do think that the early 1970s, whether it's All in the Family, Mary Tyler Moore, MASH, Maude, and all the other contemporary comedies, or all the great movies, The Godfathers, Chinatown, et cetera, or the music, the pop culture of the early 70s is when the critique of American life that emerged out of the social movements of the 1960s really became mainstream in our lives. Again, it's the hardest part in history is to kind of understand what the context was in which something happened. But, it is very clear that before the early 1970s, those ideas were not making it into The Sound of Music and The Great Escape and, Beverly Hillbillies. And so that is that moment. Now, so that's the culture side. The culture side is all of these ideas become part of our mental architecture because they become part of our pop culture, and thus they change the way we live. I mean, the role of women in society, the role of Black people in society, the way in which we trusted or didn't what we heard from government or business, that changed and did not go back after the early 1970s. Now, that doesn't mean there was a political victory behind those ideas simultaneously. And in fact, as we talked about, while all of these ideas were triumphing in popular culture, Nixon was winning 2 elections by mobilizing the voters who least liked all of the ways the country was changing. And as I say, you can win elections by promising to stop the change. What you can't actually do is stop the change. And I think the last 40 years really valid. And we have not gone back to kind of, women's places in the home, or, that you trust everything you hear from the Fortune 500, or what's good for GM is good for America. I mean, or much less trusting government after Watergate and the Pentagon Papers and so forth. So all of that, I think, shows that the culture changes faster than politics because it's more responsive to generational change. And I think we are in exactly the same place now. I don't know which party is going to win the election of 2032, but I am pretty confident that we are not going to be fighting about transgender rights in 2032 any more than we are fighting about gay marriage today, compared to where we were in the early 2000s. I mean, if you look at kind of the vision of kind of panoramic tolerance, acceptance, and diversity in pop culture today, I think that gives you a better idea of how we will actually be living in 10 years than going through the election results of 2020. I think the culture is kind of the canary in the coal mine in that sense. And then politics plays off of it, sometimes in phase, sometimes out of phase. But I think the culture, when people say politics is downstream of culture, I think they're right.
I want to just kind of throw this out. We all lived through the Reagan years. And I guess the easiest way to politically put the Reagan years was his famous speech of government isn't going to solve your problems. Government is the problem. And so we had a very, very inactive government for years and years and years. And now with Biden in office and passing like the American Rescue Plan and all this other thing, it just seems like there is an idea among the populace now that maybe the government should step in and fix some things and right some wrongs. Do you get the feeling that we're in that sort of situation now, that we're in that wave where people might think the government might be doing a little more than it has been?
Yeah, well, mostly yes, and mostly because of generational transition. I mean, millennials and Gen Z pretty clearly are open to a bigger role for government than many of the older generations. And very revealing of this is that Republicans, by and large, are not head-on fighting Biden's economic agenda. I mean, they are making complaints about it, that it's too much spending, it's going to kindle inflation, or that taxes will go up. But that's not really their core effort to push back against him. I mean, their core effort to push back is to change the subject away from the economic agenda toward more cultural disputes, things like, the border or critical race theory or, defund the police. I mean, and all of those are kind of the modern stand-ins of Nixon's agenda for his silent majority. I mean, the core, I've been since 2012, I have argued that the core divide in our politics is between what I call the coalition of transformation, the Democratic coalition, and the coalition of restoration, the Republican coalition, which is essentially the voters who either are or are not happy about the way the country is changing. And everything, there is an endless conveyor belt of cultural and symbols that conservatives put forward to constantly tell their audience, whether it's on Fox or at a Trump rally or, just kind of campaigning, that the America they have known is slipping away from them, is to convince them that, that they are losing ground to this new redefined America. And that if Democrats win, America will literally cease to, Mike Pence at the convention last year, the issue is not whether America is left or right in this election. The issue is whether America is still America. So there is, in answer to your question from before, the culture always has to have one foot in the future, because it is the cultural industries are heavily dependent on young people. And that change, especially when the generational change now coincides with racial change. I mean, the baby boom was big generational change, but it wasn't big racial change. Baby boom was 80% white because there was no immigration between 24 and 65. Now, we not only have this enormous generational transition in which millennials and Z are surpassing the baby boom as a share of eligible voters, but the change also is compounded because it's a big racial transition, right? Millennials and Z are the most racially diverse generations ever, and the one after them is going to be the first one that's ever majority non-white. So in all of these ways, the country is changing, the pop culture reflects it, and the core of the Trump appeal and of the modern Republican message is, we will make this stop. Trump almost offers himself as a human wall against the demographic and cultural change that his voters fear and distrust. But I think the evidence is pretty clear, as I write in the book, from the early 1970s, that while you can win elections by promising to stop the change, you can't actually stop the change.
Well, Ron Brownstein, I think that's a wonderful place to, very thoughtful place to say thank you so much for being on the Musical Innertube. It's been really a lovely hangout with you here.
Yep, Ron, it was really great. It was a wonderful talk. I'm sorry we're running out of time here because we barely touched on movies, which is how you open your book. Your first chapter in the book is on movies. And I would dare say that a lot of baby boomers out there would take some of those early 70s movies, like something like The Conversation, and a really groundbreaking movie, and say it's their favorite movie of all time.
And real quick, I mean, one thing I'm really proud of in the book is I think it's a whole new way of thinking about Jack Nicholson and Warren Beatty. Because I even Beatty, who kind of never raises an eyebrow at everything, was kind of interested in this take, because they're total contemporaries. They were born like 3 weeks apart. But Beatty became a star 8 years before Nicholson did. And Beatty spent the 60s inside the studios, inside the gates, literally living in the penthouse, while Nicholson was scratching for, on the absolute edge in Roger Corman movies and B movies. And I kind of tell the story of Hollywood in the 60s through the contrasting experience of the two of them, which I think is actually very revealing. But you guys have been great fun to talk with. And as I say, I envy your lived experience in the LA that I write about. I was 2,200 miles away in New York, watching the city slide toward bankruptcy. So I'm glad that you got to see LA not slide into the ocean in those years.
Well, thanks again. It's just been wonderful. And your book again is Rock Me on the Water, 1974, the year Los Angeles transformed movies, music, television, and politics. Thanks again.
Thank you, guys. Really, really appreciate it.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube. You can get in touch with us by sending us an email. It's musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com. And you can follow us on Twitter. John is @JTimPayne and Don is @DonRooney9. Our webpage is Musical Innertube. I'm sorry about that. It's musical spelled with 2 A's, .libsyn spelled LIBSYN.com. The Innertube is available on Amazon Music, Facebook, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio podcasts. You can like us and give us a good review on any of those platforms. And don't forget to head on over to musicalinnertubeplayers.libsyn.com to check out some fine radio comedy from all of us to all of you. And as always, thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for our theme music.